I am here to talk to you today about an imminent threat to our fisheries in the southeastern United States and perhaps in other parts of the country too, and that is the alarming spread of Alabama bass across the landscape. So, exactly what is an Alabama bass? So, Alabama bass are endemic to the Mobile Basin. Here in this map here, it is this large area of Alabama. Basically, it's all the rivers and streams that flow down through Mobile Bay down here in southwest Alabama. That contains most of Alabama, a slice of Mississippi, a little bit of Georgia, and a tiny bit of Tennessee up here in the Conasauga River Basin. This was formerly considered a subspecies of spotted bass. A lot of you might know this better by its former name, Alabama spotted bass. It was raised to a species in 2007. It's highly adaptable. It occupies wide ranges of habitats, streams, rivers, lakes, reservoirs. It grows very fast. It's particularly successful in deep and clear and rocky reservoirs, which means in some reservoirs, nutrients decline over time because all the stuff that was flooded finally going away and not inputting nutrients anymore. It's a common problem in some of our highland reservoirs in the southeastern United States. The water gets clear, there's no vegetation, there's no shoreline cover much anymore, and those are the kinds of places where these fish really thrive. So why are people moving Alabama bass? Well, very simple reason. They reach large sizes, they're fun to catch. They tend to school up some. They're easier to find in some of these reservoirs, especially these deep rocky reservoirs where largemouth bass are a lot harder to come by. And you see they gain a lot of notoriety in their native range, particularly in the Coosa Basin in Alabama, with a series of reservoirs there where the fisheries are major Alabama bass fisheries. And then, of course, Lake Lanier, one of the first places these fish were moved outside their native range, has turned into a stunning fishery. And a lot of people want to recreate that. They don't get as big as smallmouth bass. And they don't really get as big consistently as shoal bass, but they can get big. And that tends to be a draw. This fish here is the current world record, a little over 11 pounds, caught from a reservoir in California. This is a fish that I actually personally identified for IGFA for them to make this the new Alabama bass record. So people see pictures of fish like this, or they hear about Lake Lanier, or they think about the Coosa Basin in Alabama, and they want that where they are. And so they move the fish there, thinking that all they need to do is move it and it will turn into Lake Lanier. And so they have. In the 1970s, they've moved into the Chattahoochee Basin in the Lanier and some of the North Georgia reservoirs. In the 80s and 90s, they started moving downstream in the Chattahoochee. They were put in the Ocmulgee River. They showed up in the Savannah River between Georgia and South Carolina. And then as we rolled into the 2000s, they showed up in Tennessee and they showed up in Lake Norman in North Carolina. And then they just kept spreading from there. Now they're found in a lot of the lower and Tennessee. They're found in a big swath of western North Carolina. And now they're found in some of the areas in the upper Tennessee drainage, as well as eastern North Carolina, and most recently in Virginia. So these fish have been spread an alarming amount of places in just a few decades. So what are the problems with this? So you have this classic quote from Yogi Berra, and come to the fork in the road, take it. And that's exactly what they did. They have two paths of destruction, if you will. First one is direct competition with largemouth bass, and the second is hybridization with other species of bass. And we're going to talk about both of them as this goes on. We're going to start, though, with what's going on with largemouth bass, because this is probably one of the most surprising things that we found, honestly. So I'm going to present a series of slides that look like this. What you have here is actual catch data from state agencies that are charged with managing these various reservoirs. This is a luxury, honestly, we didn't have with a lot of the rivers and streams where you don't have these data. You don't have these standardized data, so you can't track things quite as well. So this has been a real help for us to understand how things probably happen in these rivers and streams. So this is Blue Ridge Reservoir. It's in northwest Alabama. It's in the Tennessee River drainage, so its native species were largemouth and smallmouth bass. And the Alabama bass were first discovered in 99, but not much really happened until blueback herring were found in around 2004. And you can see, if you look at these graphs here and you see these lines, notice that they start trending upward shortly after blueback herring were found. So this top one is largemouth bass, this is smallmouth bass, this is Alabama bass, and then this is all bass combined. So you see an initial surge once those herring were introduced, but what you do see here is these largemouth bass peaked and then they started declining. They never quite got quite as low as they were prior to that, but they definitely didn't just keep increasing. Alabama bass became the dominant black bass species in this reservoir. And smallmouth bass were completely eliminated. They fell off the edge of that peak there and slowly dwindled down. And biologists have not collected a smallmouth bass in this reservoir in close to a decade. Notice that all species combined increased. So the carrying capacity of this reservoir actually increased. In this case, though, it probably has more to do with the blueback herring introduction than the Alabama bass. So this is the best case scenario, and one of the only lakes, honestly, that looks like this. Lake Norman shows a much more typical pattern of what's going on. Alabama bass were first discovered here in 2001, followed by an immediate decline of largemouth bass, an immediate upsurge of Alabama bass, and that reservoir rapidly, within about 10 years, switched from a largemouth bass fishery to an Alabama bass fishery, and that's what it is today. What is interesting here is you notice that in overall black bass abundance never changed. So this is a species replacement. Literally, Alabama bass came in, kicked the largemouth bass to the curb, and took over lock, stock, and barrel. Parksville Reservoir in Tennessee is a smaller reservoir in the Tennessee drainage in southeastern Tennessee. Another classic thing, Alabama bass were first found there in 2002. You see the decline of largemouth bass. You see the large increase in Alabama bass, and they're now the dominant black bass species. What's not on this graph is smallmouth bass were completely eliminated from this reservoir, like Blue Ridge Reservoir in Georgia. But once again, though, notice the catch rate of all bass combined did not change. Once again, you're seeing a species replacement. They eliminated smallmouth bass, kicked the largemouth bass to the curb, and took over the lake. This is a different kind of graph here. This is just mean catch rates of Alabama bass, largemouth bass, and total. So your red bars are largemouth bass, your green bars are total, and the black bars are Alabama bass. And this is for several reservoirs. Some of them we've already talked about. Ballew's Reservoir is in North Carolina. Notice that largemouth bass almost declined by almost 50% from here pre-Alabama bass in introduction to post. Overall, there's basically no difference in overall catch rates. So again, you're seeing more of a species replacement here. We already talked about Blue Ridge Reservoir. This is just the mean of what's going on. So you see this huge increase in Alabama bass from pre to post. Largemouth bass also increased a little bit, and the overall increased a lot. And again, remember, this is where blueback herring seem to have somehow mediated this. Moss Reservoir is a smaller reservoir in North Carolina, and you see the same kind of thing, this huge increase of Alabama bass, a commensurate decline of largemouth bass, and in this case, another big increase in total black bass catch rates. Lake Norman, largemouth bass, big decline, and the overall is not much different. We couldn't really do a percent increase of Alabama bass here because they literally went from 0 to being all over the lake in just a year or two. And Parksville, again, showing that same thing, huge increase in Alabama bass, big decline in largemouth bass, but no change in overall. So a species replacement. So you're seeing this pattern repeated over and over and over again. And when you see this, this is where you start saying, this is not just a fluke. This is what happens when Alabama bass get introduced to places where they shouldn't be. So the consequences of Alabama bass introduction to largemouth bass seems to be direct competition. We're not exactly sure what they're doing, but there's not any genetic impacts. There's very little hybridization. And it doesn't seem to matter about the reservoir size. These reservoirs that we just presented to you are, anywhere from 1,700 acres, pretty much a small reservoir, to 32,000 acres, like Norman. Huge reservoir. Doesn't matter. The same rapid takeover occurs. Alabama bass replaced largemouth and smallmouth bass as dominant black bass species. And it's often not additive. It's not like they're adding fish there, except in circumstances like when you have blueback herring introduced. Although Lake Norman had blueback herring introduced and did not see that same kind of increase in everything. So, it's very hard to predict what's going to happen when you move fish, whether you're talking about bass or forage species or whatever, from one place to another. And so this is what we're seeing here for largemouth bass when Alabama bass get introduced into a reservoir. It's happened over and over again. What's even more scary is these impacts occur extremely rapidly, generally within a decade. And I mean, I want to go back to Lake Norman example for just a second. I want you to imagine who could have ever predicted that by putting another black bass species into this reservoir, you would absolutely flip it from a largemouth bass dominated reservoir to an Alabama bass dominated reservoir in 10 years, a 32,000 acre reservoir, just by putting a few fish in there, flip over in 10 years. That's scary for a lot of people because by the time we recognize that they're even in the lake, it's probably already too late. So what about all the other bass species? We'll follow back up on this tomorrow when we start talking about how else Alabama bass can affect other black bass species. And we'll be examining the other fork in the road to get the full picture and a few more thoughts.